do an overwhelming lesson, or pick, I think, the pinnacle moment of his faith. And we're going to look at this text where Isaac is about to be sacrificed, and indeed Abraham was willing to do that. But I want to frame this lesson with this question. How important is God to you? Has your life in various ways demonstrated that God is what matters to you more than anything else? We're going to see in this text that we serve a God that has the right to test us. The text is going to open up in verse 1 by showing that God was testing Abraham. This is still the same God that we serve today. He has the right to put you through things to find out, for you to know and for him to see that he matters to you more than any friendship, any relationship, your career, wealth, anything else. Abraham, for the world's major religions that are monotheistic, that believe in one God, Abraham ties back to all three of them. Judaism claims that they are honoring Abraham like they ought to. Islam is claiming to honor Abraham like they ought to. And Christianity is claiming to honor Abraham like we ought to. And we know that we as Christians, we are the ones that are seeking to walk in the footsteps of Abraham, that we are the ones that are spiritually in his lineage. This moment demonstrates to us what authentic faith is willing to do. I want to say this before we read this text. I think a lot of people, when we read about this story, think that this must have been a really hard moment for Abraham to have the knife up to Isaac. I want to propose, and I hope to prove this as we go through this, that this wasn't as much of a challenge for Abraham as much as we might think. But that God for a long time had been crafting Abraham's faith to get ready for a moment like this where Abraham knew that somehow or another God could take care of this situation, and I'm just going to do what he's asked me to do. How important is God to you? Let's read Genesis 22, verses 1 through 19. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. That's the first time the word love is used in the Bible. And go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come back to you again. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide, as it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. I want to say a couple things just to help us orient ourselves to what we're looking at here. Notice that in verse 1, it begins by saying, after these things. Well, what things is this referring to in the life of Abraham? You could look maybe just at the previous couple chapters after those things. I think this is sort of inviting us to panoramically look at some of the highlights of his life to this moment. Abraham is introduced in Genesis 11 as having a barren wife. Do you remember after sin enters the world in Genesis chapter 3, that one of the curses is that there would be pain in childbearing? Now, my wife and I've seen her give birth to 4 kids, and I think, from what I can tell, it hurts when you give birth to a child. Her labors were around 30 hours each. And my hands got really sore rubbing her back and everything, so I felt, it was hard on me too, all right? And so, I don't think that the pain in childbirth just means that it's going to hurt more when you give birth. Throughout the book of Genesis, what kinds of pain in childbirth do you see? Barrenness. You see this kind of creating a lot of tension and problems within families later on as well. And she's, I think, experiencing part of that curse, the pain in childbearing. She's barren, but God gives a promise that through you, Abraham, you're going to be a blessing to the world. Abraham's 75 years old when this is said to him. And he's told, go from the land of Ur, you're going to go to this promised land that your descendants are eventually going to have, and so you're going to eventually have some kind of child that these promises are going to go through. I don't know how that's going to happen. And a few years after that, they try to have a child through Hagar, like a surrogate mother, which back then, this was common practice. If a woman was unable to have a child, you'd have a child through a concubine, and then that would be considered the actual wife's child. But God is always countercultural. That it's not going to be through Hagar with that son Ishmael. Instead, 15 years after that, you have the birth of Isaac. And this is the child through whom all of these promises are going to come. And it's in this text that Abraham is now being commanded, you offer up that child. Anybody troubled by this, that later on in the Old Testament, in Leviticus 20, for example, that the Israelites are commanded to not offer up their children as sacrifices? This is some of the things that the kings, even in the south, ended up doing, and it's part of the reason for the exile that happens. Have you ever talked to a skeptic or an atheist that have brought up this story and said, God's like a moral monster? That he would ever ask Abraham to do something like this? What would you say about that? Especially at this moment in his life where finally the child of promise has been born. Okay, now kill him. Well, verse 1 clues us in that this is a test. God is putting him through this situation to see what Abraham is made of. I think that's one thing to say about this. But there's something else to say about this as well, and we're going to come back to this later. What did all the nations around the Israelites do with their children? It was common for them to offer up children as sacrifices. All throughout the book of Genesis, we're seeing that the book of Genesis is a book of origins. It shows us where languages came from, Tower of Babel. It shows us how sin entered the world. It shows us all kinds of things about, and that's what the word Genesis means, origins. I think this story could be used to actually say, God is different than the pagan gods. We don't take child sacrifice. Exodus 13:13, every firstborn of man among you, of your sons, you shall redeem with money, rather than actually offering them up as sacrifices. That God is different than the pagan religions. Now, we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But I want you to try to imagine this scene. Try to imagine that you're Abraham, and we're not told how God is coming to Abraham. Is it by means of an angel? Is it like direct, audible? We're not given all that detail. But God speaks to Abraham and says, Abraham. And for the first of 3 times in this passage, Abraham says, here I am. And the instruction is to go, take your son, your only son, whom you love, as a burnt offering. You know, there's 2 times where Abraham is told to go. The first time is in Genesis chapter 12, where he has to go and leave his future. Leave his past, rather. He has to leave where I've grown up and these things that I'm familiar with. And then the second time he's told to go, he's told to go to Mount Moriah and offer up his future with his son. And what is it that God is telling him to do? He's telling him to offer him up as a burnt offering. Now this is going to be important. In verse 10 in this text, Abraham's about to slaughter Isaac. If you read the first 5 books of the Bible like they're one book, the book of Moses as it's sometimes called, you get introduced to certain ideas at some point in Genesis that then later get fleshed out, for example, like in Leviticus. So what does Leviticus say a burnt offering is? This is an interesting thing to picture. When people talk about Abraham holding the knife up, I think in like kids' classes, whenever they have the kids' cartoon things, people have PowerPoints. Isn't it always Abraham going like this? Isn't this what you're familiar with? What's the first cut on a burnt offering? The throat. I think what the first cut's going to be is it's up right to the neck of his son. We'll say more about that in just a little bit. But as all of this is being commanded of Abraham, what is Abraham thinking? Is he really troubled by this? Is this something that's, oh man, I don't know that I could actually do that? Or do passages like this give us some information about what he was thinking? Hebrews 11:19, he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead. Okay, Abraham, take your son, burnt offering. Okay, I've never seen a resurrection before, but I do know that the God that I serve has given my wife a child through a dead womb. And I think that God could take that same child and raise him up from the dead. This is what he's reasoning. And so it says that he rose early in verse 3 the next day. There's so many details given. In verse 3, as they get ready to travel, he wakes up early in the morning. He's not delaying this. He saddles the donkey. He gets 2 of his young men. They get the wood, and they start going. And they know that it's going to be a 3-day journey, 50 miles, to this place where God has told them to sacrifice. You imagine that Abraham is with his other people, and he tells them, stay here. I and the boy are going to go up to that mountain, and we're going to worship, and we're going to come to you again. Doesn't that match what we're seeing in Hebrews 11? I trust that God's going to make this work out. So now it's just Abraham and Isaac. And there they are heading towards this area. And did you know that verses 6 through 8 are the only recorded conversation in the whole Bible between Abraham and Isaac? Father, we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Oh, the Lord's going to provide. That's all we got for a conversation between the two. You imagine that as they get up to the mountain and then they start making this altar with these stones. They would have put the neat pile of stones. And then what did this look like? Does he motion like, okay, God said he'd provide, and he looks at Isaac. All right, Isaac, I want you to get on there. We're just not given a lot of detail. But you don't read anything about any kind of struggle or them fighting about any of this. And so there he is. Imagine this child of promise who carried his own wood on the way up. I don't think he's a toddler. And he's laying there on the altar. And what's Abraham about to do? He's got the knife held up to his throat. One of my favorite quotes that's not in the Bible is that God is always almost late. And right as he's about to cut the throat, Abraham, Abraham, don't do anything to the boy. Now I know that you fear the Lord, since you were willing to sacrifice even your own son. And there is the Lord with the ram caught in the thicket, and they take that one instead of the son. All the promises are reiterated to Abraham. Now, how many of you would be willing to hold the knife up? Imagine that you're Abraham. Imagine that you got a son, and God tells you to do this. Would you hold the knife up? Think about the challenge that God is putting Abraham in this passage. If you go back to Genesis chapter 21, verse 33, this is the context of Abraham doing this in 21:33. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. The thing that he does right before this is he plants a tree and he worships the Lord. He calls on the name of the Lord. Isn't that sort of like what we're doing right now? We're singing hymns. The singing here is really great, by the way. That's cool. And we're praying. We're thinking about the Lord's things together. It's one thing to call on the name of the Lord, but then the next thing is, all right, what are you going to do about your relationship with the Lord? What are the things that are challenged for Abraham? I think the thing that he loved is being challenged. The first time I mentioned this, the first time the word love is used is about Isaac. And all throughout the text, Isaac is called Abraham's son, 12 times. So Abraham, you love this son. Are you willing to offer up something that you love if I asked you to do that? How important am I to you? Now try to think about some tests that we could be in that would test the things that we love. Have you ever had a relationship that you really loved? You loved this friendship, but there was something that that person was doing that wasn't right. It's not what God wanted that person to be doing. Do you love God enough to confront that person, even if it means that the friendship is going to be ruptured? What are you going to do? Do you love your money so much so that when there's somebody, a brother or sister in need, that I'm not going to do anything to help that person because I love my money? What about opportunities to serve? So brother so-and-so, sister so-and-so needs something, but I really like having my weeknights to myself and I don't want to have to do anything for anybody. Are you willing to sacrifice things that you love because the Lord wants you to do something for somebody or something? Remember when we talked earlier about how the way that the pagans worshiped their gods was by offering up their children? This was a common thing for them to worship Molech. It was this big statue that had outstretched arms, and people would line up to put their 4-year-olds on these outstretched arms of Molech and have the fire consume them. Abraham, are you willing to love me at least as much as the pagans love their false gods? Now think about what this might look like. Do you think there's people in the world today that love all kinds of things in the world more than we love God? You know how discouraging the last 12 years have been politically? Facebook. How many brethren have you seen being willing to lose friends over their loyalty to Donald Trump? Have you ever seen brethren willing to lose friends over their loyalty to Joe Biden? And they're going to post all kinds of things, and they're going to come and worship with these other people that they know they see different than, but they're going to be really bold about these kinds of things, but they're not willing to lose friends for Jesus. What about those cult groups that do all that door knocking? Knock, 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 can we tell you about our false doctrine? And we're going to take a false idea and be more zealous with it than people who allegedly just know what this says. Do we at least love God as much as people in the world love their false ideas and things that aren't going to last forever? And here's Abraham rising to the challenge, saying, I love you with as much fervor as you see anybody love anything in the world, because I'm going to be willing to sacrifice that which I love. What does that look like in your life? Is there anything in your life that you need to be holding the knife up to right now? Abraham is challenged in that way, but he's also challenged at the same time, I think, with his intellect. When God puts us through a test, He can put us through a situation where, yeah, maybe we've just had our tamarisk tree, we've just worshiped, we've called on the name of the Lord, but then Monday comes, and I have to choose, am I going to love God or this more? And then He can also put us through things that go, you know, I just don't know that this makes sense to me. And I'm going to have to figure out how I think through this. Again, we looked at this earlier. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, He did receive him back. Abraham was set that he was going to offer up his son. And even if it didn't make sense at first, he reasoned it out and thought, well, God can go ahead and raise him back from the dead, and that's not going to be any trouble for him. So, my wife and I, we grew up in Minnesota. I grew up in a non-Christian family. I became a Christian when I was 19. Samantha grew up in a non-Christian family. She became a Christian when she was 17. We get married a few years after that, and then I moved down to Nashville, and I trained at a church there in Brentwood. And then after that, I moved to San Diego, California, and I have tons and tons of Bible studies with non-Christians. And then I almost quit preaching because I was just overworked there, and I'd only been a Christian for 6 years. So then I go, I'm going to move to Atlanta where I don't have to do everything at that church. And so the elders said, you come here and you don't have to do all the preaching and teaching, but you can specialize in certain things that you want to learn and grow in. And I go, okay, well, I'm moving back to the South where everybody thinks they're a Christian. And that's just harder evangelistically. So I started doing studies with skeptics and atheists, like specifically targeting people like that. You know how many times I had Bible studies in Atlanta about things like, why would God allow evil and suffering? Why would God have the Israelites destroy all the Canaanites? You know how many conversations I got in with straight up atheists about that? But then I started talking to Christians who had always been afraid to ask questions like that. And so there is times where I'd talk to people and they say, intellectually, I don't understand this or this part of the Bible. You want to know what a good question back to somebody is? What have you been doing to try to find answers to that? There's one time I was talking to a guy who his dad was an elder, but he was scared to open up about the things he was struggling with. And he goes, yeah, I just don't know why God would create a world where there could be evil and suffering. And I go, okay, yeah, that's a good question. Tell me what you've been doing to try to figure out answers to that. And he said, well, I tried talking to one of the members at the church one time, and that's been about it. But I've been wrestling with this. You ever been in a wrestling match before? You know how hard it is to wrestle? If you've asked one person a question in 6 months, quit saying that you're wrestling. That's a lie. You know what faith does? God allows us to go through things that may not intellectually make sense to us, but we have to meditate it out. Try to think about, how could this make sense? How can I give God the benefit of any doubt that I have? Can you imagine a situation any more difficult than Abraham's? Kill your son, offer your son up, who is the son of promise. That doesn't make sense to me. I'm done with Yahweh. Or, I bet Yahweh could raise him from the dead. Is there anywhere in your life where you're getting tested in your love? Or getting tested in your intellect? And you're not giving God the benefit of the doubt, even though he's had every reason to prove to you that he's always been there for you. That's the first lesson here, is just the challenge of the test. I want to think about the blessing of this for Abraham, though. I think there's a couple things to say about what happened with Abraham in this moment. In verse 2, we read that Abraham loved his son, and it was his only son. Well, what about Ishmael? Well, this is the only son of promise, is the idea. But did you notice that in verse 16, after all of this happens, he simply referred to him as his son? The text begins with him, the son whom you love, and then it just refers to him in verse 16 as his son. What's refined here is that Abraham is showing that I love God more than anything else. So it refines that, but also it refines Abraham's fear. What is it that the angel says in verse 12? Now I know that you fear the Lord. Do you remember what happened earlier in Genesis 20 when he's lying about his wife being his sister? And he says this, Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. No, Abraham, you're the one who brought no fear of the Lord here. A couple chapters later, an angel is saying, now I know that you fear the Lord. Had Abraham not gone through this, would he have known how much he loves God? Would he have known how much he fears God now? You know, when God puts us through a test, am I going to love my weeknight right now more than this brother or sister? Am I going to work through this issue right now? What's the blessing that happens through it? Reminds me of James chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. For you know that the testing of your faith, God is testing in the New Testament, produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect, complete, lacking nothing. All right, James is writing to a group of people that in James chapter 1 have been scattered. If you look up that Greek word diaspora, however you pronounce that, that's a farming term. Do you know what farmers do with seed? They scatter it. So it's like James 1 is saying, you audience, you Christians, you're like seeds that have scattered across the world, and God is letting you go through tests, and you're supposed to bloom where you're planted. And all throughout the book of James, there's all this agricultural imagery that's used. Like every chapter brings up some kind of agricultural imagery. And he's telling these people who are going through all these difficulties and they're being tested that you obey. And as you go through your difficulties, you're going to become perfect, complete, lacking nothing. How many of you want to be perfect, complete, lacking nothing? I want that. That sounds great. All right, by what means does this happen? You got to go through difficulties. And you have to be steadfast. All right, let me illustrate it this way. Let's say that somebody tells you that if you start working out, you're going to get stronger. And you go, all right, I'm going to get a kettlebell. And so I'm doing my kettlebell workout, and somebody tells me that if I keep doing this 8 times in a row, and I do that 3 times, people tell me that this makes me stronger. Have you ever tried like lifting weights, like doing pull-ups, whatever? The sensation that you get when you work out is that you're not getting stronger. Like okay, where's 1, 2, 3, oh man, the 6 is hard to do. I feel like I'm getting weaker. But somehow people tell me this is what makes me stronger. It's only if you remain steadfast. If you keep doing the reps, if you don't give up on the Lord. You know what happens to Christians who remain steadfast? You might feel like you're getting weaker. But if you cling to the Lord and do what He says, do you know what you're going to come out on the other end? Stronger than you were before. That's the sensation, though, of going through the difficulties. Again, I don't know exactly how hard this was for Abraham, but through it, I think there's things being refined in him. I think one of the most important disciplines that we have to have as Christians is cultivating the right kind of heart and attitude when we're suffering, when we're being tested. I think we see this with how Abraham passed the test in this passage. This is the climax of Abraham's faith in the book. But this doesn't mean that Abraham didn't have moments where he didn't do what was right. He faltered in serious ways. He lied about his wife. He married Hagar. He lied about his wife again. But we're still supposed to walk in the footsteps of the faith of Abraham. Not any one of us every step of our lives has been perfect. And isn't it encouraging that Abraham is held up as the one that we're supposed to imitate? And you can look at failures in his own life. But God got him to a place where he was perfect, complete, lacking nothing. Look at James chapter 2, verses 21 to 23. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And he was called a friend of God. Abraham obeyed promptly. He woke up early the next day. And this passage, he's justified when he does this. Well, I got a question about that. Doesn't Hebrews 11 say that Abraham by faith obeyed when he left his homeland? So was he justified there? And then doesn't Romans 4 talk about Genesis 15 when he believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness? And then doesn't James 2 reference Genesis 22 when he's offering up a son and saying that he was justified there? So when was he justified? It's a continual thing. That when God tells you to do something, you're going to do it. When God asks you to sacrifice something, you're going to sacrifice it. So one of the things that I've done a lot since becoming a Christian, I really like listening to old, wise Christians. I was just in Atlanta this last week, and Sewell Hall is now in hospice care. He says that does not mean he's going to die next week. But whenever I was in Atlanta, I would sit and just be like, okay, what do you have to tell me? I'm a young preacher who doesn't know what he's doing. What do I need to know? And we would talk about all kinds of things. One of the things that I'm afraid is happening with my generation is that we're swinging a pendulum way too far the other way from what some of the older brethren would teach and preach. But one of the things that I've heard older preachers say that I think is helpful is that the easiest time for you to repent is right now. You ever heard anybody say that before? Today, as long as you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. If there's something that you know you need to do that God has asked you to do, the easiest time to do it is right now. Because if you wait for a day, what's going to happen to your heart? It's going to get harder and harder and harder and harder. Ask yourself this. Abraham was told, offer up your son. And he doesn't go, oh, okay, yeah, I think I got time next Saturday for that. Instead, what he does is he wakes up early the next day. Is there anything that you're coming and hearing at church, preached, maybe things in hymns, scripture readings, whatever, that you keep hearing again and again and again, and you've still done nothing about it? What's happening to your heart? Harder and harder and harder. This command does it immediately. Is there anything that you've been putting off? Otherwise, you're not passing the tests that God is putting you through. Something else to say about how Abraham passed the test is he trusted that God would provide. We sometimes sing the song, trust and obey. There's no other way to be happy in Jesus than to trust and obey. Abraham is just confident that as we're going up to this mountain, that there's going to be some way that God's going to take care of it. If I actually have to offer up my son, he's going to raise him back from the dead. So last week, on March 11th, I turned 37 years old, and I calculated it out, and I am 13,500 and, I guess at this point, 512 days old or something like that. So 13,500 days. And I'm worried about the war in Iran. What? God's taking care of me for 13,500 days, and I'm worried about tomorrow? What's the track record? You know what God does is he puts us through difficult situations, and he allows us to have the waves crash in on us, and he goes, I've taken care of you in that situation, I've taken care of you in this situation, I've always been there for you, and he gets us to a point where he could say, offer up your child, and you go, yes sir, you've always been there for me. Not once have you let me down. That's perfect, complete, lacking nothing. You want to be there? Ultimately, God provided something even better than the ram caught in the thicket. There's only one other time in the Bible that the word Moriah is used. And it's in 2 Chronicles 3, verse 1. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. And it was in this place that God sent a plague upon Jerusalem, and David was the king at the time, and they made some sacrifices to assuage God's wrath in that moment. And it's in this same place that Solomon is going to build the temple. And this temple is going to be the place where sacrifices are made so that people can be atoned for. This is later the place where Jesus is sacrificed. And you think about some of the parallels. The Father didn't spare his Son. Abraham didn't spare his Son. The Father in heaven didn't spare his Son. The Son carried the wood in this text. The Son did not open his mouth in the text. And the Father received back his Son. It was as sure as a done deal in Abraham's mind that his son was going to die, but he was going to be received back. Jesus actually died, and he was received back to the Father. Who do you think understood more about God in Genesis 22? Abraham or us sitting here right now? I would say us sitting here right now know more about God than Abraham did. And with Abraham's narrower understanding of the Lord, he was willing to offer up his son. And with us having a wider lens on who the Lord is, what he's done, how Jesus has come and made a greater sacrifice, what excuses do we have? How important is God to you? We're about to sing this song, Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. Are these the arms upon which you lean, or are you worried about tomorrow? Are you going through the tests that God may be putting in your life, having the right kind of perspective and attitude about it, knowing that God's going to take care of you? The Bible teaches that you become a Christian when you repent and you're baptized into Him for the remission of your sins. Maybe you're here this morning and you've never done that before. Don't leave here without talking to somebody about that. Maybe you have become a Christian at some point, but you've fallen off the rails and you've not been passing the tests. If there's anything that we can do for you, please come forward while we stand, while we sing.
What a fellowship.